Thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you for the invitation to present to the group. Yeah, I'm super excited to share some of the work I've been doing currently in my postdoc and also have done in my PhD. So to get started, I'm going to start with some preaching to the choir, I guess. But biodiversity provides functions which work to maintain the stability of ecological systems. However, there are a variety of threats that are facing wildlife populations, from things like climate change to land and sea use change, direct exploitation, among others. And all these different threats can interact in ways that might be difficult to anticipate and ultimately lead to the destabilization of systems and potentially population loss. And in fact, we see rates of population and species extinction far beyond background rates and across taxa. So going forward, in a world where many of these stressors are predicted to only increase in coming years, we really need to move away from a very reactive conservation strategies where we're only designing interventions and implementing them after an impact has already been felt by a community, but wherever possible to be able to actually use prediction to be able to anticipate the effects of disturbance and mitigate it before it even happens. And so we can use prediction to proactively guide protection of wildlife and devise management interventions that are based on the predictions of how organisms are predicted to respond to changes in their environment. And so you can do this by using forecasts of how these different stressors are predicted to change in an environment, designing different alternative management scenarios, and then assessing their relative impacts on a population of focus. However, when thinking about predicting disturbance impacts, it's important to note that disturbances don't affect all individuals in a population equally. So as an example, we can have here this population of porpoises and place a boat that makes noise somewhere in the environment. And so this noise may disturb animals, but really, since it dissipates over area, only a small subset of this population is even exposed to that noise source. Additionally, if we bring in an environmental context, there's heterogeneity in different environmental variables. So let's say this represents food availability, and zoom in on this porpoise here. This animal might be in a place in the environment that has relatively high food availability, and that could influence its probability to respond to a disturbance. Additionally, based on its own individual state and constraints, that may affect its ability to respond. So things like the nutritional stress of animals, how successful they've been at foraging recently. Also, if they're under a period of elevated metabolic needs, so times like if they're reproductively active or based on the seasonality, this could all influence the probability of an individual to respond to a disturbance. Additionally, animals are individuals, and as such, they may vary in different traits like behavioral or physiological traits that could all play into the response probability and the severity of a response to a disturbance. So using models that can take into account all this individual level variability can be really useful for predicting the effects of disturbances on wildlife populations. And so one method of modeling that can be useful for that is agent-based models, and I'll introduce those to you just in case you're not familiar with them. So agent-based models are also known as individual-based models, the same thing, just a different name. And they're a type of complex system simulation model. So you can simulate entire systems, but using the individual units of actually individual organisms. And so they have some properties that make them really useful for predicting disturbance impacts. And that's things like, since you are representing individuals explicitly, they can differ in all sorts of relevant traits. So things like maybe the sex, age, reproductive status, or body condition of animals can all vary. And since these models are often spatially explicit, you can have interactions happening locally on a scale that is similar to the way that interactions are occurring in the real world. Additionally, animals can be equipped with adaptive and fitness-seeking behavior that allows them to make decisions under specific contexts, and that can allow them to try and improve their fitness. And additionally, since they are spatially explicit, you can have very dynamic, high-resolution environments where you can represent many spatial variables. And animals then in the environment, they interact with that and are influenced by the conditions based on where they are, both in space and time. Also, as these models proceed in like discrete time steps, you can follow animals over their entire lifespan and then across multiple generations. And finally, they work on the concept of emergence. So it's all this individual level behavior and interactions that are driving the system level behavior, which then feeds back to influence the experiences of simulated animals. All right. So to link behavior to population dynamics, we can use things called energy budget models. And so a lot of my work is using energy budget models. Not all the examples I'll get into today will have an energy budget, but most of them will. And so these can be useful for linking changes in food availability or changes in environmental conditions to the probability of starvation or changes in reproductive investment of individuals. And they allow animals to dynamically prioritize different metabolic processes. So under times of maybe nutritional stress, animals may prioritize their own survival over non-vital functions. And so they're structured based on general equations, which are rooted in first principles. And then you can use species-specific parameters to actually parameterize it for a specific study system. And what you're left with is something like this, where you can track how much energy an animal is expending on all of its different metabolic processes over its lifetime. All right, so yeah, in my work, I like to combine agent-based modeling with theory from physiological ecology and foraging ecology, along with population ecology, to be able to develop tools that are useful for predicting the impacts of changes in the environment on wildlife populations. And so what I'll do today is introduce 3 case studies, 3 projects that I've worked on across my PhD and now my postdoc. So the first will focus on this species, which is the harbor porpoise. This is the species I worked on from my master's all the way through my PhD. And harbor porpoises are really interesting because they're a whale, but they're a very small whale. And they have very high metabolic rates. So compared to a terrestrial mammal of the same size, harbor porpoises have field metabolic rates that are about double what you would expect. And this ensures that they're really dependent on very high feeding rates, so they can feed almost continuously to meet their energetic needs. And this together suggests that porpoises may be a species that's particularly sensitive to disturbance. But despite this, they're extremely widespread. They're a very successful species, and they inhabit coastal waters all around the Northern Hemisphere. They're also a very seasonal species. So in the areas that I was working for my PhD, the water temperature can fluctuate a ton throughout the year. So anywhere from 0 degrees in the winter up to 20 degrees in the summer. And porpoises also exhibit reproductive synchrony, where females get pregnant and give birth around the same times of the year. And so the different energetic constraints throughout the year can change a lot. Additionally, if you look at how this temperature variation changes seasonally and then compare it to the body condition of animals, where here we're talking about body condition as being the amount of blubber that animals store around their body. So they have this thick layer of fat that encases the entire animal and is useful for offsetting heat loss, but also serves as energy storage, among other functions. And so if you compare these things, you would see that water temperature does this cycle that I mentioned, but then blubber depth kind of does the opposite thing, where animals are fattest in the coldest months and thinnest in the warmest months. And so this might be useful for offsetting heat loss throughout the year. All right, and so at Aarhus University, there are 2 groups that are doing a lot of very cool porpoise research, looking at the behavior, physiology, all sorts of stuff with porpoises. And there's also an agent-based model that was developed there. And this is called the DPONS model. And this is the project that I came into for my PhD. So DPONS was formed out of concern that increasing offshore wind farm construction could negatively affect sensitive marine species like harbor porpoises. And it was formed when 5 offshore wind farm companies came together with the goal of modeling the population level impacts of noise on harbor porpoises in the North Sea. And they wanted to be able to use this model as a tool for planning and mitigation of future disturbance events. So the reason that noise is such a focus here, though, is because noise can actually, the different properties of sound can cause behavioral changes in animals where just because of the experience and the exposure to the sound, that can cause them to respond to it, which that immediate response can cause some impact on life function. So things like stopping feeding or nursing or predator response can all be affected by this response to a noise disturbance. And ultimately, this can affect the reproductive success or survival of individuals, propagating up and ultimately affecting the population. So what may seem as like a discrete and acute response to noise can have population level effects when occurring at a large enough scale. So the idea being here that these changes in behavior, one pathway that they could affect the vital rates of porpoises could be through energetics. So these impacts on feeding and their ability to meet their energetic needs. So coming into the project, the DPONS project, I developed a process-based energy budget model for harbor porpoises that took into account different metabolic processes of just basic body maintenance, thermoregulations, the cost to stay warm, activity costs, and then reproduction, so both pregnancy and lactation costs, and also lean body growth. And so animals in the model need to meet all of these different metabolic costs by taking in enough energy from their environment. And if they're not able to meet those needs, then some of these costs can be, the allocation can be reduced under those periods of nutritional stress. All right. So this energy budget model was plugged into an existing model, a version of DPONS. And so that was first implemented in the inner Danish waters. And there was already a movement model that I'll talk about in just a second. And then we also had to plug in some relevant environmental data for the energy budget model to work. So we needed things like temperature and salinity maps that varied seasonally for the region. All right, so briefly touch on the movement model. Movements in this model can be broken up into 2 scales. First, large scale movements that allow animals to go between different parts of the environment based on their knowledge of kind of generally where a lot of food is for that time of year. And then there's also fine scale movements, which allow them to exploit food patches. And so these fine scale movements are broken into different vectors. So they take into account both a correlated random walk that allows animals to encounter new food patches, spatial memory, which allows animals to return to food patches where they found food in the past. And then there's also a deterrence vector that kind of points animals away from a disturbance if they encounter it. So going forward in developing the energy budget model, we used what is called pattern-oriented modeling approach that is kind of rooted in the idea that the replication of natural patterns in a model provides evidence that it may be fit for its intended purpose and that its predictions can be useful for supporting decision-making. And so the idea being that you have the model, you produce some outputs, you evaluate them against a suite of patterns that you think are relevant to your specific purpose, the application of the model, and then if a pattern is not replicated that you know is important for that specific purpose, you can go back to the drawing board, think about what the model is, different processes it represents, and maybe come up with a solution that allows the model to more accurately represent those key patterns in the system. And so this pattern-oriented modeling approach offers like a systematic approach for confronting models with empirical data, and these patterns can be observed and should be observed at different hierarchical levels of the environment. They can be used to balance model complexity by ensuring how much complexity is needed to represent those key patterns. And they can increase the chance that the mechanisms that are driving the pattern in nature and those that are driving it in the model are the same. And so the idea being that you're going for structural realism, meaning that the model is realistic enough to address its intended purpose. So you're using these patterns throughout the entire modeling process to evaluate the performance of the model. So here in the energy budget model, we parameterized and calibrated the model using several patterns. Two of which I'll show here are how energy use changes with swimming speed and also body mass of animals. We then evaluated the model against a suite of other patterns, things like age class distributions, seasonal fluctuations in body fat, and also like state-dependent blubber mass of animals. Then we applied the model to several different applications, but I'll talk about one today. And that one was inspired by the idea that climate change may influence different ocean abiotic processes, things like temperature, salinity, currents, upwelling. And these can all influence the abundance and distribution of primary producers. And these impacts at that top of the base level of the food chain could then propagate up, ultimately affecting top predators like porpoises. And so in this project, we really focused in on potential changes in the prey structure that are driven by this and how they influence porpoises. So we've focused in on two different potential changes in prey structure that are both expected with increasing temperature. So these could be observed decreases in fish adult body mass and also potential changes in the distribution, like spatial distribution behavior of fish communities. So we took these two changes in prey structure, plugged them into the energy budget model, and evaluated their impacts on movements in space use and also the population dynamics of porpoises. All right, so for these scenarios, we ran the model under three different spatial aggregation levels where the same amount of food could either be clumped into dense food patches or kind of distributed more evenly across the environment. And then we changed fish length. So over the simulation period, fish length could either increase or decrease as over a 10-year period. And then we also tested some different changes in the environmental conditions directly. So how salinity and temperature may change over a 10-year period. And those were based on maximum and medium predicted decadal changes for that area. Okay. So what we found is that based on the spatial aggregation level, that environments with more densely aggregated food patches could support a higher population of porpoises. And then when we looked at the changes in the fish length, we found this bigger fish supported a higher population, which makes sense. But also as fish length decreased, we had very strong impacts on the population, with population collapse occurring like around year 16 in the most extreme scenario. So this is all the results together. But what we wanted to look at here was, because we know that this, like our decreases in fish length were based on observations from the area that have already happened. And we see that the porpoise population is fairly stable. So there must be something going on that allows animals to be able to compensate for these changes. So what we decided to do here was take into account the fact that porpoises are known to be able to ingest large amounts of food when required after times where they have had low foraging success, and use that along with this scenario here, where we had this very strong population collapse occurring, and say, okay, can porpoises compensate for this loss if they're allowed to try and consume more food as the fish length decreases? And so what we found was that, yes, they could make up for it by consuming more fish to make up for these decreases in fish size, but that there was a little caveat to that I'll touch on in just a second. All right. So overall, we found no direct effects on climate change. So direct in terms of energy use. So just changes in temperature and salinity didn't influence the overall energetics too much of this species for the levels tested. But indirect effects that could occur with these changes in prey structure did have large impacts on the predator populations. And we found that animals could compensate for these decreases in fish size, but to do so, they had to increase their consumption rates. And these increases were over 21% higher than would be predicted based on changes in biomass alone. So meaning that animals moving around in a landscape, having to locate additional prey resources may incur costs associated with that searching, which should be accounted for when predicting the impacts of changes in food availability on animals. All right, so moving into the next study. So we'll move from the ocean to the sky. Now we're going to talk about the common noctual bat. So common noctual bats are small, endothermic flying mammals. They once again have very high foraging requirements. However, the food that they depend on, these insect aggregations, are very ephemeral and patchily distributed in their environment. And to make things worse, bats can only detect prey at very close distances, like less than 10 meters away from themselves. So in order to try and understand how bats can effectively meet their energetic needs based on these conditions, the mobile sensory network concept was proposed. And so this concept is rooted in the idea that bats can only sense food at a very close distance to themselves, but they can hear another bat and understand its and decipher its behavior on a much larger scale. And so if animals are foraging in a landscape solitarily, based on this small detection range, they might miss food patches. But instead, if they eavesdrop on the acoustic behavior of other bats, they can form what is called like flight alignment and actually be able to more effectively scan a landscape and be less likely to miss a food patch. And it's because if one animal finds a food patch, then the other bats within the acoustic area of that bat can hear that it has now switched into foraging mode and then zoom in to be able to feed on the prey patch. All right. So in this project, it was really cool. It was a very combined approach where we had both an empirical portion and the modeling, complementary modeling. And so for this project was kind of formed on the idea that it's very difficult to observe these sensory networks or these like complex foraging strategies empirically, because you really need a high resolution simultaneous tracking of many individuals in an environment to see how they're moving relative to one another. But in this project, we did just that. So this was led by Dr. Manuel Rulicki, and he did a tagging study of common noctual bats that recorded the movements of 81 bats. And this was an entire colony of these bats. And this was done over 5 recording sessions in 3 consecutive years. And so from this empirical tracking data, they were able to use integrated step selection analysis to ID where individual bats interacted. And then they used that to define the different movement characteristics of bats based on their distance to a conspecific. So, and that's dependent on the behavior of a conspecific. So they can decipher whether that conspecific is searching or it's hunting, and then assess the changes in distance of a focal bat based on that. All right, so then we were able to take these movement patterns and use them to develop an agent-based model of bat social movements. All right, so the model itself is based on fairly simple distance-dependent rules, similar to Boyd's dynamics, where you have bats that can align, be attracted to, or avoid other bats, and based on only their closest conspecific. So each bat is keeping track of the closest animal to itself that's within its perceptual range. And then this will determine its movement behavior. And so we calibrated those movements to the empirical data so that those changes in distance were reflective of the same that we saw in the empirical data set. And so then we use the model to assess whether bats are actually able to locate food quicker when they're using these sensory networks. So the theory suggests that that would be the case, but we wanted to see if bats moving similarly to how they were in the empirical data could actually find food faster. So we focused on this by running scenarios where we varied the number of bats in the environment, the number of food patches. The number of food cells was kept the same, but it's just the different distribution of those food patches. And then the foraging strategies of bats. So we broke this down into each of the different kind of stages, the mobile sensory network. So only solitary foraging, only local enhancement, only flight alignment, or the full mobile sensory network. And so we ran each of these kind of separately to assess their relative impacts on food localization. All right, so what we found is that we did get mobile sensory networks emerging from the model. So even though each bat is only paying attention to one other bat, there are situations where bats would form much larger networks. And for the most realistic setting, we found on average, these networks were composed of 3 individuals. Then when looking at the food localization, we found that when food was really patchily distributed, bats located food much faster using the mobile sensory networks. So this is the number of food patches on the x-axis here, and this is the time until bats find their very first food patch of the night. And so and each color represents the foraging mode. So at these lower number of patches, meaning that all the food in the environment is kind of clumped into a few patches, bats find food much faster using the sensory network than foraging solitarily. However, as the food is distributed more evenly, this benefit decreases, and at really homogeneous landscapes, it's actually faster to just ignore other bats and find food on your own. It's kind of a distraction to pay attention to the behavior of other bats in those settings. But then when comparing the scenarios where we ran different numbers of bats, what we found is that for solitary animals, as the number of bats increased, it would take more and more time for each individual bat on average to find food. But that this kind of increase in time was offset when the sensory network was used. So this could actually keep this time until finding of food fairly consistent as bats use the sensory networks. And so then when comparing the different scenarios, you see as there's more and more bats, this benefit of sensory networking increases relative to solitary foraging. So overall, we found that bats were able to locate ephemeral and patchily distributed resources faster when using the sensory networks. However, this benefit diminished with decreasing group size. And for animals that are very social, it very likely evolved this strategy over a very long time. This could suggest potential for allele effects that could occur as bat populations dwindle, and the benefits of this evolved strategy may be diminished. All right, and so quickly moving on into my last case study. So this is the current project that I'm working on at the BioMove project. And now we've moved from the sky to the terrestrial plane. So we will be in this project, this is really inspired by the vast amounts of variation that exists in different metabolic traits. So for example, this is basal metabolic rate, but mass-specific basal metabolic rate. So this has been adjusted by the mass of an individual. And so this is just for rodents. And you can see here that especially for small rodents, there is a huge amount of variability that exists. And this is just one trait out of many. In small mammals, there's a massive amount of variation in energy use. And so for this project, we were curious about what gives rise to this variation and how is it driven by different changes in the environment. So for this, we developed a different model, and that is composed of 4 sub-modules. The first being a movement model that allows animals to forage in the environment. Then we have an energy budget model, which I'll go into a little bit in just a second. And then a demographic submodule that allows animals to reproduce and various kinds of mortality to occur. And then there's also an evolutionary component that allows for the evolution of different metabolic traits in the animals. All right. So just to give an idea of how this energy budget works, it's quite similar to the other one, but slightly different. And so here you again having energy come in from the environment, and then the animal has a variety of different energetic costs. So maintenance, activity, reproduction, lean mass growth, and the additional energy can be stored as storage. And one thing that's really nice about this approach is that we can allow storage to actually drive the allocation to reproduction and lean mass growth using body condition dependent curves. And I'll talk about those again in just a second. But there's also some nice connections between energy intake. So energy balance will actually drive the probability of an animal to move in the environment, And then also storage levels drive hunger, depending on whether an animal is kind of too fat or too skinny, that will influence its hunger in the model. All right. So in this model, we're trying to develop some different context-dependent relationships for how allocation can occur based on an animal's body condition. So allocation to growth, reproduction, both pregnancy and lactation, and survival of adults, embryos, and offspring are all driven by these curves, and these are all calibrated to fit empirical data. So here we have both, you can describe them in different ways, but we have both the curves can shift and change in steepness depending on how well they fit the empirical data. And so from this, we are not having to assume anything about any optimization. We don't have to use any thresholds, which may be arbitrary for deciding how an animal allocates energy to its different processes. And instead, we can fit some of the most challenging to understand relationships in energetics to empirical data in realistic environments. And so we could do that using pattern-oriented modeling and different computational methods like approximate Bayesian computation to define these relationships. All right. And so in this model, we want to look at individual variation and inheritance of different metabolic traits, how those emerge and how they influence the vulnerability of populations to changes in their environment. And then also, ultimately, we would like to look at plasticity and metabolic rates, but that is not in there yet. So this work is supported by vole research and small mammal research that's going on in two different groups at the University of Potsdam. We have the animal ecology and biomove projects that both do a lot of really cool empirical work on bank voles. And then also there are a variety of different selection experiments that have been done on the species where they've been selecting for a variety of different traits. So this is my favorite image I've ever found in a scientific paper. And so in this, they're actually able to select for different traits. And when doing so, they can measure actually inherited changes in the metabolic traits of this species. And so for this model, we again we calibrated it. And so we did this using approximate Bayesian computation, as I mentioned. And so for here, we used 17 different empirical patterns that we had. And these were things like how total body mass varies with age or storage levels of animals. Additionally, a lot of reproductive patterns, things like neonate mass, the total litter mass by the age of pups, and things like mother milk transfer depending on her litter size. So we had a lot of different patterns, and then we used that to calibrate the model. And what we ended up with is some narrowing of quite a few of the different input parameters. And then we could take that to form these allocation curves, and we took the 30 best and implemented those directly into the model. So then once that was done, we evaluated the model against 11 additional bank vole patterns, and I'll just show you one of those. But for things like how overall daily food consumption differs with the different age class or reproductive state, and found that the model was quite successful at reproducing a lot of these patterns. So like I said, I unfortunately don't have too many results to share with you yet. We've been really heavily working on the model development. But some directions that we'd like to go into are exploring things like the pace of life syndrome hypothesis. So how pace of life emerges in different communities, and under what conditions do species evolve following kind of the predictions of the hypothesis, and under which conditions do they not. And additionally, the evolution of different energy management models. So all of these different metabolic traits and allocation to different processes are independent of the model. So that allows a variety of different energy management models to actually emerge from the predictions. And ultimately, the goal is to then use this to assess the vulnerability of populations with different traits to changes in their environment. All right, so just to close out, going forward, to be able to protect biodiversity, we have to be able to make better predictions. And to do so, we should use models that are really grounded in reality, rigorously tested, clearly communicated, and used strategically to maximize their power as tools for conservation. But additionally, I think, especially in ecology, there's really a desperate need for model intercomparison and the evaluation of forecast accuracy. And I wish I could show results about that, but this is not something I've been able to do too much of yet, but I hope to be able to continue in that direction going forward in future positions. All right, so I thank you so much for listening, and I want to thank both my supervisory team for my PhD at Aarhus, and then also here, the BioMove group, and my supervisor, Florian Jelsch, at the University of Potsdam, and the rest of the BioMove crew. All right, so thank you. I will stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Cara. That was brilliant and beautiful slides as always. Presentation. So yeah, round of applause from me and from the audience. So I can see if you're happy to take some questions.
Yeah, of course.
See, we've already got a couple in the chat. So Istem is the first question. Istem, did you want to come online and ask it yourself, or did you want me to ask that?
Sure, I can ask. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks for this brilliant talk. It was really nice to follow. I was wondering, so you have been moving from different settings. Is there a difference in terms of predictive performance of the models that you're developing when you move from oceans to skies to the land, like in terms of 2D versus 3D space kind of?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to think about when moving in all these different realms. Yeah, in terms of predictive performance, like, unfortunately, I haven't been able to say, like, for certain, like for the porpoise model, like, for instance, like knowing that the population trajectory actually matches up with the porpoise populations, because it's really hard to measure changes in the population size at a level that is consistent with the predictions. I'm hoping to be able to do that more, but to actually say, I think that, you know, I think the models that I make are capable of reproducing the patterns that I have, but going forward and predicting something at a level like population size and being able to evaluate the performance is not something I have been able to really do yet. But I hope that we can get better and come up with some methods that will allow us to pull data in a way that is useful for evaluating the models. And my dream would then to have different modeling approaches and then evaluate that performance in a way that's consistent. But it's a hefty project, and that's something I've been able to do.
Great, thanks, Cara. Next question is from Mariana. Did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, or do you want me to ask that for you? Yes, go ahead, Mariana.
Thank you. Thank you, Cara, for the amazing talk, as Vicky said. So I have two questions. So the first one is how you relate your work to the world of physiological ecology, because I mean, of the type of data that you need, if you talk to physiologists and the type of experiments that they need to run or they can run. So what are the challenges?
Yeah, so definitely a big thing in my work. Like, I love physiology. I love modeling, but I think physiology is just so inherently interesting to me. So I think that is one of the things that has been a little frustrating, that it seems like, you know, physiology and modeling of physiology are kind of two separate worlds. And I think as much as we can connect them as possible would be amazing. And so I'm trying to pull in some things that we are now learning that maybe haven't been considered to this level before about physiology into the models. And I think the small mammal world has been really good for that, because we have a lot of really great physiologists doing really cool stuff. And there's, you know, you can keep rodents in a lab. Keeping a porpoise in a lab is much more challenging. So I think, yeah, definitely pulling in what we learn about physiology as much as possible in the models will be definitely a challenge and definitely interesting going forward. But again, I think it's so dependent on having some standardized ways to assess the model performance to know whether or not the inclusion of some property is actually useful for evaluating the outputs. Or for making predictions. But I think kind of more collaboration between empirical physiologists and modeling energetic modelers is definitely needed.
Yeah. And my second question is actually about your evolutionary component. It really got me excited and thinking. And I was thinking if you are actually going to test, or maybe in the future or whatever in your career, no, I don't know, this concept of a fast evolution, or like fast evolution in your traits, because like it can be expected that a species can evolve, let's say, can present some fast evolutionary traits in face of drastic and dramatic, let's say, climate shifts, as we see like every year, or like along those lines. I'm not an evolutionary ecologist, but I have read about this. That's it.
Yeah, that is definitely along the lines of what we're doing. I think that it's super interesting thinking about like how different animals can adapt, like at what scales the animals can actually adapt to changes in their environment, and what kind of conditions. And so we have very abrupt changes that might, push a population in one direction, or whereas gradual changes might do something different, and then a combination might produce something else. So I think that's why bankfuls are super interesting species, because they have these ongoing selection lines. But then we can take that and understand some heritability basics about these different metabolic traits, and then use that in the model to predict how this population more theoretically could adapt to changes in its environment. And so ultimately the goal would be to both look at, inheritance for that change, but also plasticity, because they seem to have a lot of plasticity in some traits, and there's a lot of cool work being done measuring that sort of plasticity. So that's definitely the direction we're wanting to go in. Like, when do we see slow species evolve, and when do we see fast? And how does each, how capable is each then resulting population able to cope with, predicted changes in their environment with things like climate change or other disturbance activities?
Super, thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. There's another question then in the chat from Saeed. Did you want to unmute?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yes.
Yeah, cool. Great. Thank you very much, Cara, for your interesting talk. Well, actually, last minute registration I had, but yeah, it was great for me to attend. I was wondering, are there any, how can I say, differences in terms of human activities and human impacts in your modeling? For instance, comparing individuals or communities that they are located in marine protected areas, and comparing with those that they are migrating different locations, or even areas that they are more anthropogenic activities. But also another question, well, are there personality matters in this species or in your modeling as well, or not? Yeah, thank you very much. It was great for me. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so a lot of the work that I've done, so the DPONS model, the porpoise model, that energy budget model went into the bigger existing model, and then that is applied to all sorts of different scenarios. So for that, we looked at things like how the timing of noise disturbance can influence the population, because I showed that like seasonality that occurs in the morphometrics and the physiology of animals. So we wanted to see how things like just varying the timing of a disturbance event throughout the year could impact the populations, and it could have a huge role. So just by paying attention to like seasonal variations in the energetic constraints of animals, you may be able to mitigate the impacts of disturbance. Also, there was definitely a lot of thought put into like spatial areas. So like the species might use different nursery grounds, so areas that are more protected and quiet, which could be useful for the mothers to be able to effectively nurse their offspring. But maybe then these areas are much more sensitive to disturbance, because you have a subset of animals that has very high costs there. So there's definitely like lots of cool things we've been looking at, and now it's being implemented in like the full tool for the full North Sea, and then we'll be able to explore impacts from things like even small ship noise, seismic surveys, offshore construction, all sorts of stuff, and together as well. So definitely a lot there. In terms of personalities, this is something that I'm just starting to really get interested in. BioMove as a project has been doing a lot of very cool work with animal personality, a lot of stuff with looking at how biodiversity or species can coexist based on differences in personality, a lot of work empirically measuring personality in animals. And this is definitely a direction we'd like to go into, but I have not incorporated it yet. But there are some really cool models that have come out of BioMove that do consider personality. So there's a couple in both focused on small mammal communities. So if you check out the BioMove project and look for personality modeling, there's some cool stuff definitely there.
Yeah, great, thank you. Any more questions from anybody? Istam's back with another question.
I was just wondering, is this BioMove data is like open? Can there be, for example, a forecast challenge launched on this data?
Yeah, maybe. Gosh, yeah, I think so how BioMove works is it's like this big overarching project, and then there's different PIs that kind of interact within that. I think definitely some of the data sets are available. And I have not thought about that, but that's a really nice idea. So maybe I could think about what kind of data sets would be available and kind of poke people, and then maybe we can use some for certain forecasting challenges. That would be super cool.
Thanks.
That's a good thought. We've been talking about getting a European forecasting challenge going. So yeah, cool. Maybe we'll get in touch with BioMove. Great. I had a question, if that's okay, as taking my chair privileges. So I had a question about, you mentioned with the DPONS project working, or that coming out of this collaboration between 5 energy companies operating in the North Sea. I wondered if they've been receptive to the information coming out of the DPONS model, and whether they have made any changes to their activities based on some of the advice that you guys have been able to give from your modeling efforts.
Yeah, so they still do work together. Vattenfall specifically is like kind of the primary one, and they do actively use DPONS so to run scenarios for different management plans, and they seem to be quite receptive. Like they paid for it, so at some point like they want to use it to some extent. I think the pickup of it has been slow. Having a complex like agent-based model over, some of the more simplistic analytical models that have been used so far is definitely, I think, a challenge to encourage people to embrace that sort of complexity. But I think it's slowly growing, and it's definitely picking up. So I think other groups now have expressed interest in other even countries in using the DPONS model for their areas as well. So it's grown.
Super exciting. Yeah, that is cool. And is the model then, would it be possible to take it out of the North Sea and put it somewhere else?
Yeah, so I think the movements have been very, they're specific for the area. So I think the movements make it tricky, but assuming that you have the data, like it's just tracking data of animals. If that exists for another area, then it can be like those movements recalibrated for that region, and then uploading the maps is fairly straightforward. But it's mostly the movement behavior that's different. But yeah, assuming, for a very, very data poor area that animals move similarly, that can be done, but just knowing that the results are based on that assumption, or it can also be refit to the area if the data are available.
Great, thank you. Okay, any last questions for Cara? Anyone? No, I see silence. So in that case, just a massive thank you, Cara. That was brilliant talk, beautiful slides, and great answers to questions. Thank you everyone for coming and listening to Cara's talk.